Hello everyone, my name is Nathan, and this is the first video in my R tutorials series. So I'm making this series for pretty much anyone who wants to get a greater understanding of how R works. I'll have brief episodes on how to organize your data and your files. Base R code will be the focus of this series. I'm not really going to get too deep into too many packages. There's a handful that I'm pretty fluent in, so I'll go into those at some point. But for the most part, this is going to be base R, and we're going to focus on the basics of R code and file organization and how to make some nice documents. So this episode is really mostly background info on how to set up your R Studio for coding and a little bit of advice on how to make documents with it. I'm not actually going to get into any code in this episode, but I feel like this is still really important information, especially if you're just kind of using like a prescribed R workflow for a statistics course or something like that, where you're not really getting the information on how R is actually working. So if that applies to you, or you simply just want to get a little bit more detail on R, then I invite you to join me in explorations of R Studio. So what is R? Before we get into actually using it, we should probably know what it is. R is an object-oriented coding language, which means that you can save objects and outputs in bits and pieces to analyze and manipulate for later cohesion. So it's nice because you can produce something, say an output to a statistical test, and then you can do stuff with it. And you can do all that in real time. You don't have to write a program, wait for it to compile, and then go back and look and see what it did. And then if it errors out, then you have to go and figure out where it went wrong. Nice thing about using R like we're going to is that you can do all this one step at a time, and you won't waste your time writing 1,000 lines of code based on an incorrect assumption about how a piece of the code works. Now it's kind of similar to Java and Python if you have other coding experience, probably more similar to Python. But from what I've heard, R is a little bit more malleable, a little bit more flexible with how you can do things. There's usually multiple ways to go about solving your problems. Which is very useful, especially in science. You can also write in those other languages using the R Studio. So if you do happen to know Python or Java or Bash or C++ or a lot of the other languages, you can actually write in R Studio because it functions as a generic IDE, an integrated development environment. That's just the fancy name that this whole interface is called. Now, R is compartmentalized for working efficiency, but a little bit less efficient in terms of computing power because it has those objects built in. So they take up space and memory that wouldn't otherwise be taken up by a non-object-oriented language like Bash, for instance. Those require the use usually of a server or of Windows PowerShell to run kind of in the back door of your computer or server. And I find them a little bit trickier to learn because there's no objects. There's very little interface. You're just kind of typing in your commands and hoping that it works. But they're a good way to go really fast through some hefty code, especially if you're analyzing like DNA or tons and tons of data. But R is great for a huge number of everything except the biggest of data sets. Now, R is comprised of base R as well as many, many, many user-created packages. They all come together to just have tons of functionality. Like I said, you can basically do whatever it is that you want to do with R. You just have to know where to look for the code. So let's start with creating our first document. So just in case you have never opened a document in R before, this is kind of what you're greeted with. Yours will probably look a little different than mine, but this is the typical first couple of panes that you're greeted with. Each of these windows is called a pane. And so this top right one is your environment pane. This will show you where all of your saved objects are. You can also have it show different things, so like your history of code. I'm not sure what the connections does. There is a tutorial from some R packages, but I've never used it. The environment is really what you want there. And then you also have your files. So this shows you your home directory or wherever you happen to be. This is your default working directory, so it's the default file in your computer system that you're in R. It has access to all of these things. You can create folders there, you can create files there, you can delete and rename files, etc. You can also have it show you plots, and it'll show you what packages you have installed. You can get help on a certain command or package. This viewer, I think, shows you like objects and data frames. I'm not quite sure what the presentation tab does. I actually never used it. I like to keep my files down here, though, just so I have easy access. So you'll notice this is a console. You don't really want to use this unless you know what you're doing. So if you go up here to the top left and you see this little page icon with the green plus sign on it, this is where you create a new document. And so you'll notice there's a bunch of them in here. I always recommend people use Markdown. I feel like more people tend to use scripts. What I don't like about scripts is that it's just this. It's just like a text document where you can run code. The problem with that is if you want to type in human language, like English, you have to use comments, and there's less formatting available for that, and it's a little harder for me to keep it organized, at least personally. So I'm going to use a Markdown. You'll also notice there's a notebook, an R notebook. I think that's similar to Markdown, but I've never used it personally, so it might be a little different in some ways. There's also text files. This is the same that you would get if you were opening like Notepad on Windows computers. There's a C++ file, Python script, all these different types of script files that if you know coding, you can use them. If not, then I wouldn't touch them. I have never used any of these other languages. So I'm going to open a Markdown. Now, opening a new document will give you this pop-up, and it will let you kind of select what you want to call it, all that. So I'm going to call this R lesson 1. That can be whatever you want it to be. Doesn't matter. And your name will probably automatically fill in, but if not, you can just type it in. The date, I like to get rid of the date just so it's not on there, but you can leave it. It'll just go under your author name on the final output. In the final output, you can have it put out an HTML file, which is the easiest because there's no other setup required, and it doesn't look quite as professional as a PDF, but it looks nicer usually because all of the text wrapping isn't broken sometimes, like PDF is. First of all, you need a tex file, so either MikTeX or TinyTeX, I think, in order to actually make a PDF. Once you have that, the PDFs do look pretty nice, but what happens often for me is in code settings, the English typing not so much, but the code typing, usually I end up with text wrapping issues where a lot of my code will actually go off the screen and not go down to another line. So that can become an issue formatting-wise, but otherwise PDFs do look nice once you get them set up right. Word can be glitchy. It can work fine, but it can also work really poorly depending on what kind of code you have and what kind of plots or images or anything else you have in there. So I would say exercise caution using Word. I'm just going to use HTML. So this is what you're greeted with when you open a new R Markdown file. The first thing you'll see, actually I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing I like to do when I open a new document that I'm going to work in is to save it. So it's the standard floppy disk icon up here to save your document. And I'm just going to save it as this, lesson 1, because I've already created this file, but I'm going to resave it. And this, you can just change your directory to whatever you like it to be. Yes. Okay. So now that it's saved, it'll show the name up here. If it has this name and it's just white, it's not like blue or grayed out, and it doesn't have an asterisk on it, that means that it's currently saved and it has updated to what you're seeing currently. When you start typing in it, it grays it out and it puts the little star up here to show that it needs to be saved. Now, you can close this and it will still reopen to the same thing that you had when you left it. But if you try to close the document, it will ask you if you want to save it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, when you're in a markdown and you first open it, this is what you'll get. So you'll get about 30 lines of stuff. The first 5 here, this is called the preamble. And this is very important. It needs to be there, and it will break the document if you change it in a way that you're not supposed to. So I would say don't touch it unless you know what you're doing. There are a couple of functionalities that we'll use up there in a later episode. I can show you how to put in a table of contents and also how to get R to actually add your citations and references for you, which is pretty cool. It uses BibTeX. So that is a good way if you're doing like a research project or some kind of statistical workflow or analytical workflow that you need to cite references. You can do that using stuff in the preamble. Directly below the preamble, we have the setup chunk. This is also very important. It needs to stay here. It will not show up in your final output. There's a couple things we can do with it that I'll show you later, but for now, just leave it there. Leave it alone. Don't change anything. But this is what a typical chunk looks like. It's got these are called grave symbols, and then in curly braces it has the letter R to indicate that it's the R coding language, and then a title that you can give it, so like setup or cars, and then these are chunk options, which I'll cover later. And then the tail of the chunk is 3 more of the grave symbols. So this demarcates where the chunk starts and ends, and you can also see that it's kind of like a faded color here, as opposed to just the plain black background here. Now, everything below this is just example text, so you can look at it if you'd like. I'm going to delete it though, because I've seen it a billion times. But you're welcome to look at it. It has some example code. So let's take a look at some human language formatting, just real quick in markdowns. Note that you cannot do it the same way in scripts. This is why I like Markdown better. The only way you can type in a script is it's basically one giant code chunk. So you have to pretend it's a code chunk if you're writing in a script. And you'd have to use a pound symbol and then write a comment here. That is the only way you can put human language in there without confusing the computer. In Markdown, you can just write out here. As long as you're not in a code chunk, you don't have to write in code. You can put whatever you like here. The nice thing about Markdown, or one of the nice things, is that you have all these formatting options. So if you want to put headers or section titles, you can do that. You just need a pound symbol. So as if you're writing a comment in a code chunk, if you're outside of the code chunk in the Markdown, you can put a single pound symbol, and this is a big header. Now, you don't need the space here. I like to add spaces, but you don't need them. It doesn't change anything. If you want a medium-sized header, oops, I can't spell. There's the header. That's a medium header. This is a big header. This is like giant. This is like font size 48 or something like that. It's quite large, and I rarely use them. I think it might even be bigger than your title, actually. But I do like to use these medium headers, and then you also have paragraph-sized headers if you put 3 here. So also, you don't need to close them out at the end or anything, but you can if you want. That's totally up to you. It will produce the same result. You'll also notice that I'm adding extra lines in between things. This is to prevent the text from lumping together on one line. Sometimes it does that in the output, and I'm not quite sure why. So the easiest way around it is to just have extra lines. Let's see. We also have asterisks, which can be used to type in different fonts, or different font styles, I should say. So if you want to italicize your words, you can do a single word, you can do a whole paragraph in italics. You put a single asterisk, type what you want, and then close it with another single asterisk. And that is, you'll notice it changed color. It's not going to show the italics in the viewer, but it will change it in the output. If you want to use two asterisks, oops, goodness, okay. If you use two asterisks, you'll make it bold. Actually, you can't have a space here, though. This is my fault. So that's bold. And notice that it does all the words that are within these. So you do have to kind of be careful where you put them. You can't just type a single asterisk in your text and expect to use it as like a footnote or anything, because it will think that you're trying to italicize. You can even make it italic and bold at the same time with three asterisks. That obviously seems kind of overkill sometimes, and I don't think I've ever actually used it. There's also ways to write in equation formatting, but that would require the use of LaTeX, which is a little complicated, so I'm going to make a video on that later. That's pretty much most of the font options. I'm not sure if there is a way to underline your font, but there might be. I haven't tried it. I can look into it if anybody's really curious about it. Otherwise, I'm going to show you how to personalize your interface real quick, because you'll probably have noticed that your default RStudio, if you just downloaded it fresh, is going to be mostly white. It's going to look a lot like Notepad, and I find that kind of hard to look at for a long period of time. I like light text on dark backgrounds, and this will give you a whole bunch of color options too. So even if you do like the white backgrounds. So if you go to the Tools tab up here at the top, Tools, go to Global Options all the way at the bottom, and it'll pull up this little box. So this gives you all kinds of information about your settings. There's lots of settings to change. I would recommend just kind of keeping changes to a minimum. But what you want to do is on the left, go to the Appearance tab, and then this is what I currently have it set to. So you can change your font. I like the code console kind of look, so I'm going to keep it at Lucida Console. But you can change it to whatever you like. There's a number of options. And then you can also change the font size. I like it a little bigger than default, I think, just so that it's easier to read. And then these are your color themes. So I think the default is this TextMate. So if you like that, then keep it there. But there's all kinds of cool options. Some of them are a little more faded. Some of them are like pastel. You know, there's different colors. This one's kind of greenish. I personally like Cobalt, which is rather blue, and I also like Vibrant Ink. That's what I've been using. Those are my favorites. I think, which one was it? Eclipse. Ooh, that's very bright. I don't even think I've looked at all of these. There's a lot of them. But I'm going to keep Vibrant Ink. To set that, you can just click Apply. Now, keep this box open, or if you happen to close it, then go back into Global Options. And we're going to just check that you have the same settings that I do, just to make sure that if you are following along, that you get the same results. Because sometimes this might change the way that R will knit your document, and it may or may not change the functionality. So if you go to this SWeave page on this pop-up box, you want to set the first drop-down to knit R, and then you'll want to change the second one to PDF LaTeX. I don't know what the defaults are. They might be default anyway, but this is what I have it set to, and it works for me. I'm not exactly sure how this changes it. It changes the way that it generates a PDF. I know that. But I don't fully understand the actual details behind this. Also, make sure that these first two checkboxes are checked. And then this, I don't think this matters too much, but just make sure that this looks the same as yours does. And then click Apply and click OK to get out of that. So there's one last thing that I wanted to show you in the text editor here, And that is that you can actually put a picture file in your markdown document. And it will show up in markdown, and it will also show up in your final output as a full-sized image. So if you have a JPG or a PNG or some other image file, you can just do this. And you don't even need a code chunk to do it. So to do that, you just need to have an exclamation mark followed by open and close square brackets. I think you can put a name in the image. So like this would be like the image name. I'm not sure how that shows up in your output though. And then in parentheses, no quotes or anything like that. You need the file path of your image. So you can either go into your directory and figure out what the file path is of the image, but you'll notice over here that this is called home in RStudio. This is not actually a home file on my computer. It's actually my documents file. So it's calling it home because this is like your default working directory. And if you need to know what it is, you can click on this ellipsis button over here with the 3 dots right underneath the refresh. And if you click on that, it'll pull up your file explorer and show you that it's the documents folder. Now, you can go through and type in the C:/users/blah blah blah, or you can use the shortcut. As long as nobody else needs to run your code without changing it, because it won't work if you change which computer or system you're on. But if you're using it just on your own personal computer, you can do this. For home, wherever it says home here, you can just put a tilde, which is usually in the top left of most keyboards, if you don't know where that is. So you just need a single tilde mark. That's your home directory. And then you just need to know the rest of the file path from there. So the image I want is in the rdocs folder. And, excuse me, I want this sweave.jpg. So this is just a screenshot of the menu options that I just closed. So you'll type /, and then for me it's rdocs/sweave, and you do need the file extension .jpg, and then you close the parentheses. And so this is written out correctly. If you save your document and make sure it's recently saved so that this text up here is white, and you click on this, just click anywhere in it, it will pull it up. And this is the image that you've just put in there. So now if you leave this here, it will show this image in your output. And that's all there is to it. So I am going to call this episode done because I've already gone longer than I planned to. But I hope you found this helpful. The next episode will involve getting the basic code mechanics down. So you'll learn to actually write in the code chunks using the code to do some basic operations. And then we'll expand on that later. So you know where to find me, or you can email me if you have questions, of course. But thanks for watching.